Stonehenge may be one of our most iconic monuments, but it's also connected to a much wider sacred landscape. And much of this important landscape is part of the Stonehenge, Avebury and associated sites World Heritage Site, an area of over 26 square kilometres containing some of the most incredible prehistoric monuments in the world. But not all of these monuments are as well known as the mighty megaliths at Stonehenge. So, to help celebrate the 35th anniversary of the World Heritage Site, I want to invite you to take a look beyond the stones and explore with me how enigmatic long barrows can provide tangible connections to ancient communities, how epic avenues lined with huge stones can help us see how important journeys were to these people, and how even gigantic earthworks can give us insight into the people who made them. Using archaeological discoveries, intriguing artefacts, artistic reconstructions, and of course, state-of-the-art technology, we'll explore the incredible stories of the journeys, people, and communities behind some of these magnificent monuments. To help understand the World Heritage Site, I'm going to see Dr. Matt Levers at the Cuckoo Stone, as he discusses how the results of some recent excavations have helped increase our understanding of communities and belief systems within the landscape. Hi Matt.
Hi Emma.
As visitors, we might think that the excavations have stopped in this area, but with Wessex Archaeology has actually undertaken quite a few recently, haven't we? Can you tell me more about them?
Yeah, of course. We carried out a very large programme of excavations, what we call the Armed Basin programme for the Ministry of Defence. We excavated a site just behind me there on Lark Hill, and then another one over in the distance, in the middle distance there at Bulford, right on the edge of the World Heritage Site. The earliest and most interesting thing that we found was at Lark Hill, just over there, was what we call a causewayed enclosure. At its simplest, it's a circular space that's marked out by a ring of banks and ditches. It's called a causewayed enclosure because in between the individual bits of ditch there's a causeway. Mm-hmm. So it's not a continuous ring of ditch, it's a broken, like a string of sausages with gaps in between. They're not defensive, they're not meant to keep people out, they just close off the space. And this is in the early Neolithic, this is sort of just after 4000 BC, so 6,000 years ago, more or less. And at that time, people weren't sedentary, they were still mobile, they moved around, they probably were nomadic pastoralists, they moved around herds of animals and this kind of thing, they didn't grow fields full of crops and this kind of stuff. So they're mobile and they move around, probably seasonally. Fairly small groups, family groups, things like this, and then every so often they all meet up at various times in the year. And this is probably what these causewayed enclosures were. It's the places where individual groups of people who have spent most of the year moving around with their animals come together to meet up. People will have met up to exchange marriage partners, whatever their equivalent of marriage partners were, that kind of thing. Exchange animals, perhaps. People from Cornwall would maybe come in here with the stone that they mined from the Lizard Peninsula that's very good for making axes. Pottery from that part of the world travels over to this part of the world. You find axes from places like the Lake District. There's lots of things are moving around.
Really, people are moving all around and they're centring in this area.
It might not necessarily be one person coming all that way, but the thing might be passed from hand to hand and the objects might travel that whole distance. So they will have been the places where people came to carry out all those kind of activities that glue a society together. If you're fairly small, disparate groups that meet up occasionally, the occasions when you meet up are really important for like social cohesion and things like this. So This is what these cordon enclosures will have been, and they'll have been religious centres as well, because obviously that's a part of how you glue your society together, is through religion. But at Larkhill, what we found is that one of the gaps between these ditches, one of these causeways, was very broad. They're normally not very broad, but this one was metres and metres wide. So, and it looked to be an entrance. And this entrance, it pointed off down a dry valley toward the River Avon. And just coincidentally, it also seemed to point at a hill in that direction called Silbury. Now, Silbury Hill is the highest point on the horizon in that direction. From the cordon enclosure at Larkhill, looking out of that entrance towards Silbury points in a very particular direction. And that direction is the direction of the sunrise on midsummer. And that's the thing that obviously you see at Stonehenge. I mean, Stonehenge is points to the same thing. It points to that exact same phenomena. Much later, 700 years later, but it's a repeated thing. So we can say with some degree of certainty that cordon enclosure at Larkhill is where it was, precisely because it was situated to take advantage of that sun rising over Silbury Hill. It's a very important location in the landscape.
It's mind-boggling that the archaeology that we can dig up can tell us about beliefs and practice, because it is actually dug within the landscape, even though it's religion's an ephemeral and intangible concept.
Yes.
The way that they situate how they live connects to that.
It does. I mean, normally when we're thinking about archaeology, we think about objects, thinking about pots or animal bones or tools or things like that. But sometimes you get glimpses into what's going on in people's heads, and that's when it gets really interesting, is when you can actually figure out what these people were thinking and why they might have been thinking it. The evidence at Bulford is contemporary with the founding of Stonehenge. So when Stonehenge was...
Let that sink in.
When Stonehenge was first built, before any of the stones were there, and it was just a circular bank and ditch with a ring of uprights, possibly timbers, possibly stones, people were on that hilltop at Bulford doing all sorts of very interesting things. Where we're standing now at the Cuckoo Stone isn't only interesting because it's the Cuckoo Stone, it's also interesting because of a line that it sits on. Because that way is the Stonehenge cursus, which is essentially a 2-mile long straight line made by a bank and ditch, and it points to here. Right?
So things are starting to be connected.
Indeed, and if you carry on that way, you can see on the near horizon in front of us Woodhenge. Now Woodhenge is, again, that's later, that's late Neolithic, but there's early Neolithic material underneath it. That sits on the same line. If you keep the line going, a dead straight line, it gets to that hilltop at Bulford. So there's a line that's marked out through the landscape of early Neolithic sites.
So we're starting to see, just from standing here, that our focus shouldn't just be Stonehenge. It is actually the wider landscape that moves out. We've got people moving, we've got trade, we've got Larkhill, we've got the causeway enclosure that predates Stonehenge, this version of Stonehenge. And then we've got, later on, we get Bulford. It's all starting to rise up.
You can't hope to understand Stonehenge just by looking at Stonehenge. It doesn't exist in isolation. It's an integral part of a much bigger landscape. This is one of the reasons why a lot of interpretations of Stonehenge don't make sense, because they just look at Stonehenge. They're inward looking, and inward looking is no good. You've got to be outward looking, because everything connects together. This whole landscape, all these features of this landscape, they all connect together.
From speaking to Matt, I'm beginning to see how the excavations at Larkhill provide an insight into the people of the early Neolithic. But I want to find out how these early communities came to be. What made people gravitate towards this area? And how did those communities interact with the early phases of Stonehenge? To find out more, I'm joined by a familiar face. So behind us, Phil, is Bulford, and it's quite important to this wider heritage landscape. Can you tell me more about it?
I guess after 50 years of digging, if I had to pick out one, it'd have to be Bulford. It's an amazing site, and it's one of those sorts of sites that makes you glad to be an archaeologist. We didn't know it was there until we dug it.
What did you find?
There was always, right from the word go, when we went over it with aerial photographs, what looked like a big pair of spectacles, a figure of 8.
Yeah.
And these turned out to be 2 late Neolithic henge monuments, very, very much smaller versions of sort of Stonehenge and the Durrington walls behind me and all that sort of thing. But ceremonial monuments, but they're quite late on in the story. The first in the story was a dead man. And he was an early Neolithic man. He was buried on top of the ridge. And what I think is important about him being up there is that the people who were living on the site were actually living in the valley. And I think what we've got here is this continuity, because down in here you've got the Avon Valley. That's where the Mesolithic people were living. And so the next stage in our island story is from the Mesolithic into the early Neolithic. They didn't just up sticks and come straight out of the valley. They carried on a lot of those traditions. One of the beauties of what we found at Bulford was that we were getting traces of early Neolithic people living in the actual valley. And then they would be burying their dead up on the ridge. And I think when they put him in the grave, they marked that grave with a mound. And then, after that, that site became special.
Do we know why? What sort of life he might have lived to make him so special?
Not yet, we don't, but we will learn more about him and where perhaps he came from, whether he was a local or whether he was an immigrant, once we start doing some scientific techniques. And that's the beauty of what we can do these days. We've got so many techniques that are available to us now that would not have been available to us when I started my career 50 years ago.
How was it that people came to revere that site and build that kind of figure of 8 double henge?
Well, you see, after our early Neolithic burial, there's another phase, and that's the really important one for me anyway, because we found 50 pits, and they were filled up with an amazing array of late Neolithic, early in the late Neolithic.
Yeah.
We're looking now about 3000 BC. 2950 BC to be precise, because we got so many radiocarbon dates we gave up counting. They are all exactly the same date. And the crucial thing about that is that is the time when they were actually starting the groundwork at Stonehenge. That's when they were actually cutting the ditch and creating the bank. Those people who are living at my site in Bulford may have been part of the ground workers who were actually building Stonehenge. And so you've got 3 phases. You've got our early Neolithic burial, who kickstarts activity on the site, really starts to make it special. Then you have our people at the early end of the late Neolithic, about 2950 BC, the people who started building Stonehenge. Then you get the 2 henges, and they're going to be the same people who were starting to put up the big stones at Stonehenge. So you've got this lovely little link between my site at Bulford and the most famous site in the area. And that's what makes it so wonderful, because I can do that excavation there and I can contribute not merely to this local study, but our whole study of Neolithic Britain, if you like.
You mentioned that there's lots of different artefacts, an abundance of artefacts found within these pits. What were some of the things that were more memorable?
The material from my site, it's the largest collection of material of that date from the south of England. It was literally groundbreaking stuff. Wonderful flint work, a really superb object, a discoidal knife. I never found a discoidal knife in my life. And after 50 odd years of digging, you tick the box because you found one. It was like Christmas.
Flint bingo, yeah.
It was Christmas come early. Our pottery from Bulford. We got a similar set of pottery from on this side of the Avon. So we've got 2 sites of the same sort of date on both sides of the Avon. Where do you reckon the pottery has got the nearest connections then in style?
I don't know, somewhere else in the local area? I don't know.
Orkney.
Orkney.
We've got pots that were made in Orkney about 3000 BC. you could lose them with the pots that I had at Bulford. But they were also creating phenomenal Neolithic monuments. And so this is that transfer of ideas, this transfer of people. And this is what makes the whole thing so wonderful. You're not just looking at one spot in Wiltshire. You can start exploding the whole thing. And that's the beauty of archaeology, making those advances. And this is the wonderful thing about our new techniques. And thank the Lord, they decided to build a housing estate just at the crucial site.
So with the excavations at Bulford, have they opened up our gaze that by looking out from Stonehenge, we start to see that people are connected with different sites?
It does relate so strongly to Stonehenge, but it so strongly relates also to the River Avon, because now we've got Bulford of about 2950 BC on the east side of the valley, which is associated with the Tor Stone, and we've got a contemporary site associated with a Cuckoo Stone on the west side. So you've got two contemporary sites, both making the same sort of pottery, both got links to Saracen stones, and both got direct links to Stonehenge.
The Neolithic site at Bulford shows how people at that time were connected to the wider world. The incredible assemblage of pottery shows how the sites in this sacred landscape weren't only important locally, but drew people in from distant places. Nowhere is this more visible than in the incredible beaker burial known as the Amesbury Archer. Discovered just 3 miles southeast of Stonehenge, he is an exceptional discovery.
We discovered the burial of a man between 35 and 45 years old who was buried with an immense amount of wealth and objects of the Beaker period, which is right at the intersection of the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age, for instance, a very dynamic and interesting period that's happening. We obviously were keen to understand where he had come from. And one of the techniques that has been coming in the last 10, 20 years and it's been refined and getting better was isotope analysis by looking at what is stored in his teeth, which gives a little fingerprint of the origins where people have come from. And that has very clearly indicated that he came from the Alpine reaches, maybe central northern Germany, Switzerland, Austria, that area, and in fact is a migrant. It is interesting to know that at that particular time there are huge changes in Britain, but certainly Stonehenge, the last phases of Stonehenge are also happening at around about the same time. We can probably surmise that one of the draws that brought him to this region was the power and the nature of the activities going on as determined and shown by Stonehenge, these huge monuments which have drawn people in, drawn ideas in, and would have acted as focuses for the communities, not only locally, but potentially internationally. The thing about the Amesbury Archer that is exceptional is the sheer volume and nature of what was buried with him. Over 150 objects were buried in total. He didn't have one beaker pot. He had 5 beaker pots. He had copper knives. These are some of the first copper knives in Britain to have been found, some of the earliest. But he also had flint knives. He was right at the cutting edge between the end of the Stone Age and the Bronze Age period, and his finds reflect both sides. We also have some of the earliest gold jewellery found with him, hairdresses. He had a number of other objects, which is why he got called the Amesbury Archer, provisioned for the afterlife so he could hunt and provide for himself, with a mass of flint arrowheads, He was buried with wrist guards for his wrist, which are finely ground stone, which would have been lashed to his wrist and protect against the bow coming back. But those objects are from the continent. They're from Spain, potentially France. At his back was a small cushion stone, which analysis of it afterwards shows that it's a mini anvil. And that is one of the keys, again, at this crucial period in history, where metals are starting or just coming in, the very early Bronze Age, that here we have an individual who has proof and evidence. They were a metal worker. They would have been seen as being magicians at the absolute cutting edge of technology. They would have been incredibly important to those communities. And it can't be a coincidence that the Amesbury Archer, where he came from continental Europe, was an area where copper was being produced very early. So the Amesbury Archer is really just signposts some of the ways that we can now get individuals and get the individual stories. You can trace their movements, not only with the materials that they had and brought with them, but also now the secrets that are hidden inside their bodies, in their teeth, their movements. And this science is absolutely fantastic. Thousands of years ago, these people were making huge journeys. You know from the goods being traded and things, but now you can point to an individual. You can actually hold and see an individual that made these trips and journeys, and that is fascinating.
The Amesbury Archer and his grave goods provide archaeologists with a scintillating insight into one individual's impact on a community. But as I head some 23 miles north to the other half of the World Heritage Site at Avebury, Phil has promised me an even more tangible look at prehistoric communities and their burial practices. So this is amazing. Can you tell me a little bit about what this place actually is?
Well, what we are now in is the chamber of the West Kennet Long Barrow. It's literally an early Neolithic tomb, if you like. And it's about, 3,600 BC, something like that. They excavated it in the 50s. And there was probably anywhere between 30 and 50 individuals, people in here. There were some burials, inhumations, but there were some cremations as well. But the thing is that because we can walk in now, they would have been able to walk in then as well. And what you're doing is that they have an association with their dead. And they would probably have selected bits of granny to take away because they worshipped her, they had an association with her. And quite oftentimes, if you look at early Neolithic monuments, you find bits of humans, not the whole thing.
Would anybody be allowed to come in here and bury Granny, or would it be only special people?
Well, we don't know, but you see, this is one of the beauties of what we can do as archaeologists, because we can excavate these things. Now, I know a lot of people in the modern world say you should respect the dead and revere them and all this. We do respect them, but we want to learn about our ancestors. Archaeology is all about people, and our one place where we can actually touch the people is in a burial chamber like this, because we can actually recover their remains.
It's just so exciting. This is the first time that I've been in this long barrow, and I'm completely blown away. If I touch this is quite rough, and all this is quite roughly hewn, but that bit there was soft. It was almost like it's polished.
That is a grinding stone. It's where people polished and ground stone axes. And so that stone was used for something else before it was brought in here. This stone here is sarsen.
This one here.
It's one of the hardest stones, well, it's one of the hardest stones I know. That's hours and hours and hours of somebody just going to make a polished axe, a flint axe.
That's amazing. So the stones mentioned, these are sarsen, and these are local to this area?
They're local to the area, but what is not local to these areas are these stones down here. Now these are a limestone,
yeah,
and they're being brought in from anywhere between 6 and 20 miles away. You don't bring this by lorry.
No.
The only way you can do it is by people. It just goes to show what a community, a public effort, if you like, a construction like this would be. And you got to remember, this thing is 100 metres long.
Yeah, it's not just this bit that we can see.
It's not just this bit.
Do we know what's beyond?
It's part of a chalk, I mean, it is literally a chalk bank, and it would have been thrown up from the contents of the chalk on the ditches on either side. This is all human labour again, fueled with antler picks, hefting it up by hand, and at the end of it, you get this gleaming white monument that is going to dominate the landscape.
It's not grassy.
Not grassy at all. But you see, there is an added bonus. There is an added bonus, because it means that from an archaeological point of view, that area of Neolithic landscape has been sealed for like 5,500 years. So if you want to learn what the natural world looked like 5,500 years ago, then what you need is a sample of the old ground surface that's been sealed underneath these banks. That's what makes so many of these areas around Avebury and Stonehenge and all the rest of it so important. The monuments are incredibly important, but it's the landscapes underneath that they protect and preserve that really is the source of so much potential information about the world that they lived in.
So we've come up this big hill, but as we were walking up, I saw there was another quite unmistakable big hill over there.
You noticed that one, did you?
I did, yeah. Can you tell me more about it?
That is Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric man-made mound in Europe. Want to come and have a look at it? I've actually got a personal story about that.
Oh, I'd love to hear it. Let's go.
What I love about this area down here is that we aren't down in the river valleys. Now, in a lot of cases, the archaeology is actually better preserved in the river valleys. If you can find them, that's the difficulty, finding the sites. But what is happening in the river valleys tends to be that the soils are building up. Whereas if you go up onto the top of the hill, ploughing is moving all the soil down, so that the actual soil cover and the site preservation is far worse up on top of the hill than it might be down here. So from an archaeological point of view, these environments are absolutely crucial.
And you've actually dug on Silbury Hill, haven't you?
We did. I was here in 1969, the year that man landed on the moon, and I can remember being there. We dug a big hole in the outside ditch, and periodically we could go into the mound. Access to the mound was into this tunnel. They shot a big tunnel right into the core. What I can remember about that, I shall never forget, is that Actually, the right in the middle, the actual core of the monument is constructed of turves. They actually built it up in stages. But the first stage was to strip off all the turf and build a turf mound in the middle, a turf core. And because you've had all of that chalk cover it, literally the grass was still green. You could see Neolithic grass. You could see Neolithic plants. As an example of what this part of the Kennet floodplain was like in the late Neolithic period, that is just an absolute, it's a time capsule. It is a gem for archaeology. You come here and you have to stand in awe of what our Neolithic ancestors achieved, our prehistoric ancestors achieved. What we can learn about things like that is this amazing amount of labour input, the organisation that it would have involved, the time scales, and more importantly, or just as importantly, the backup. The labourers who were involved in that would have needed to be fed, housed, watered. They would have needed all the backup to keep them going. And this is a long-term project. The one thing that I bet you they weren't bothered about was time. How long is it going to take? The main thing is we want to build this thing. We are going to create something to be proud of. And that is something that we can tend to overlook. How long is it going to take? When you're going to finish? When you're going to finish? Get on with it. That would have taken as long as it takes.
Well, I think we should take our human activity up to the cafe now, and I'll get you a drink, but it might not be a pint. How about that? All right, Phil, come on, let's go. Right then, Phil, here's your coffee as promised.
Oh, welcome cup of coffee.
So whilst I've been in the cafe, this has appeared.
Yeah.
What is this beautiful and gigantic bit of flint?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's sort of self-gratification. I mean, for a start, you know how I love flints. And I suppose the sites that I've been talking to you about have been principally Stone Age sites. And the Stone Age sites are based around this flint, what I call the master substance. You know, it is their means of cutting, scraping, doing all the functions that they can. But this bit here is exceptional.
It's gorgeous and tactile.
I really think this object was to them a point of reverence.
So this is not like a big hammer or anything like that?
No. This object, I found this in a field just below where the West Kennet Long Barrow is. You do not get flint of this size in the Avebury area. It ain't there. And that means that flint was brought into the area. I think the most likely source is East Anglia.
All the way from East Anglia.
And so that then sets in motions these ideas about some of the patterns that we've been talking about, how people are mobile in the landscape, how they've been moving around the countryside. And of course, this site is literally a stone's throw, not literally a stone's throw. Yeah, no, not that stone, but a stone's throw away from the Ridgeway. So you're looking at your Neolithic motorway. That is coming down, and it's coming down to the Avebury area.
Yeah, what made them stop from thinking, oh, I can make a load of axes out of this, I'm gonna, all the tools I need for life. I know you'd like to get your hands on this, wouldn't you? And
but no, I do, but I wouldn't want to break it up. It is such a beautiful object. It's not just a stone tool. It's a thing that you put on an altar. I keep feeling that so much of what is important about that is if it's viewed in profile. We've walked up to West Kennet Long Barrow. you've seen Silbury Hill. You've not seen Silbury Hill from above. You cannot see Silbury Hill from above unless you're in an aeroplane. You see Silbury Hill in profile. And I think that this thing was designed to be seen in profile.
You really get a sense of that, echoing the reverence of those landscape features. It's just...
And you see, it's not just those landscape features that we see in profile. There's a lot of natural features that we see in profile. The setting sun, the rising sun. When you see that coming up over the horizon, what do you get? You get this wonderful curving profile. And it's that relationship that those people that lived in prehistoric period had with springs, with rivers, with the natural world. They knew that natural world far better than we do in a lot of respects. And I know I'm hypothesizing about this. To most people, they might say it's just a block of rock.
It's very beautiful.
But when you start pondering about it and you start thinking about it, where it's come from, the mechanics of getting it down there. Trust me, as a flint knapper, the craftsmanship in being able to make this sort of thing. And then you realise that it is, I don't know, to me, a totemic, to probably use that word, totemic item. It is a thing to be revered. It's exceptional, it is unique.
Through our journey so far, we can see just how deep the connections go between people and this sacred landscape. And these connections are still with us today. These incredible monuments still hold that magnetism and mystery. As visitors to the World Heritage Site, we can walk through the same monuments as these ancient communities. We can touch worn grindstones inside burial mounds and perhaps even share that same sense of awe as we behold the huge sarsen stones within this landscape. One particular place within the World Heritage Site that I find completely awe-inspiring is Avebury Henge. And to help me understand this site further, National Trust archaeologist Dr. Nick Snashall has agreed to meet me at the Cove Stone. Hi Nick, thanks for joining us. Can you tell me a little bit about the Avebury stone circles in Henge?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say about the Avebury stone circles is they're the largest prehistoric stone circles anywhere in the world. And they're not just one monument. We've got a huge stone circle, and inside it are two smaller stone circles. And in each of those, there's another stone setting. And outside of all of that, there's a vast ditch, which is about 9 metres deep everywhere it's been excavated. And outside of that is a commensurately large bank, which has 4 entrances in it. So it's just a vast monument in and of its own right.
Now, Stonehenge and Avebury are connected as being the World Heritage Site, but is there any kind of archaeological connection between the two sites?
Absolutely, there are several connections. For a start, they're built and in use at roughly the same time. So when we look at the whole of both of the landscapes that surround them, the monuments in them all run really from the beginning of the Neolithic, the period of the first farmers, right through to the end of the early Bronze Age, so right down to about 1500 BC. But more than that, there's a physical connection with some of these rocks. The stones that you see here at Avebury are sarsen stones. And of course, we know that some of the larger rocks that you see, those great grey lintels at Stonehenge that are so famous, they're sarsen too. And at least one of them came from not that many miles away from here at West Woods, which is also on the Marlborough Downs, which is where Avebury is situated.
This gigantic rock that we are standing in front of, what is it?
This forms part of an inner setting of 3 stones, which the antiquary William Stukeley in the 18th century named the Cove, because the 3 of them together looked a little bit like a cove or a harbour. A few years ago, there were some concerns that this stone and the other surviving stone here of the Cove were leaning a little bit. And so there had to be some engineering work done. And because of that, some archaeologists Professor, as he is now, Josh Pollard and Professor Mark Gillings, were sent down to excavate at the base of the stones. They got over 2 metres down, and essentially the engineers said, you don't need to go any further because this is not going to fall. It's so deep in there and it is so huge. And the engineers managed to calculate what the approximate weight of this stone must be, and it weighs a minimum of 100 tonnes.
That's almost unfathomable to imagine. So it's 100 tonnes over 2 metres down. Do we know what it was used for? Like how do they interact with this very tactile, massive monument?
We don't know for sure at any of these monuments exactly how they're used, but one of the interesting things about the shape of this cove, as it originally was, is it's a little bit in form like if you think of the horseshoe of stones that sits in the centre of Stonehenge. So, and we kind of see these horseshoe type settings in a number of different places and monuments where you have this inner setting. So it's likely that this was one of the central foci of the monument. And as far as we can tell, this monument appears to be ceremonial in nature, ceremonial or ritual. We don't find the remains of everyday life inside the henge and stone circles, except for in much later periods. So in the medieval period, you know, people were living partially inside the henge in bits of the village, not during the Neolithic when they built this, not the early farmers. So it's a clean monument. And then outside of it, of course, we have that enormous ditch with a bank. Now, if this were defensive and you had a sort of settlement or a fort-like thing, you would expect the ditch to be outside of the bank. So what they seem to be doing instead is zoning off this special area. And why do you need a 10-metre deep ditch to do that? Well, that suggests, to me at least, that what you've got is what is seen as a very powerful space in here, where possibly there are rituals and ceremonies going on. And maybe some of these stones were felt to be, you know, to contain, who knows, the spirits of the ancestors, the gods, or at least that there were special activities that were carried out here that needed to be contained.
So one of the reasons we're also here in this absolutely incredible landscape is that it is the 35th anniversary of the World Heritage Site, and you've been digging here for around 17 years. So how does that anniversary make you feel?
So World Heritage Sites are important for what's called their outstanding universal value. And what that really means is that they're special to all people for all time. And so that kind of gives you a sense of just exactly why these monuments, these landscapes are so important. So I feel actually very privileged to work here and to help explore, but also to care for this place, and hope it'll be here for many, many generations to come.
Can you tell me a little bit about where we are now?
We're just standing within the remains of what's known as the southern inner circle. And this was one of the two inner circles that sat within the great outer circle, which in its turn sat within the huge ditch and bank. And what we can see today, some of these stones were re-erected by Alexander Keiller in the 1930s when he excavated here. There were a few stones still standing, but he found some that had been buried in the medieval period as well. And where he found those, he re-erected them and put them back into the position that they'd originally stood.
Because he did quite a lot of furious kind of research, didn't he, to really get the right location?
He did. He was an amazing guy, actually, Keiller. He was very particular, and he sort of gathered a team around him who comprised some of what came to be some of the greatest archaeologists of their day. Keiller excavated here in the 1930s, right up until the outbreak of war in September 1939. And one of the things that he did when he was digging here is he had a very strong sense that he wanted other people to understand the site. So when he found a place where a stone had once stood but had been broken up and taken away, what he did was erect one of these small markers that you can see here. And you can see they're almost like little pyramids. And he is, of course, doing this in the 1930s. And in 39, when he's putting these ones up here, you're only, 17 years after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. So you've got that whole kind of slightly Egyptian deco vibe going on as well. But he seems to have put quite a lot of thought in to what the markers should be like. And he wanted to consider very carefully something that people wouldn't mistake for a stone, but they wouldn't miss either. And they could see that it's man-made, but it would give them an indication, an impression of what the site would once have been like.
And one of the other phases that we were talking about earlier are these two stones here. Can you tell me more about them?
Well, the two large ones that we see beyond the southern inner circle are what we call the portal stones. So essentially these are gateway stones into the huge henge bank and into the stone circles. And originally there would have been 4 entrances. A number of the stones survive today, some of them fallen, and these are the only 2 that are still standing. If you look beyond that, then that leads down through the entrance of through the banks and onto the West Kennet Avenue.
And all these stones here, are these the ones that Alexander Keiller found, or did he put them back?
Well, some and some. So there were some stones still standing here in the avenue when he came here, but he also re-erected quite a number, including placing his little markers here as well to mark where stones have once stood.
It's amazing. You see it as you walk up here. As we look up towards the top of the hill, we can see some of Keiller's stones that he's put in, but we can't actually see Avebury Henge at all now, can we?
No, it's really interesting when you look at this avenue. It leads all the way from the sanctuary. It's almost 2 miles long, but it weaves its way here. So it weaves throughout the landscape, and it just kinks round to the left as it comes over the top of the hill and then kinks back again. So it takes in other monuments along the way. So we've got, as you come over to the top of the hill, you've got Windmill Hill, a much older enclosure site right in front of you, framed, and then it turns you back towards the massive banks of Avebury Henge with the stone circles inside it.
And is that a deliberate movement? Is it to kind of help tell a story of what's around, do you think?
Very much so, I think. So you're looking at societies that relied on oral tradition to pass on information and memory. So moving through the landscape and referencing monuments along the way that might tell stories about people's ancestors or things that have happened in the past would have been a really important way of maintaining that information from generation to generation.
I heard of some excavations recently just down there. Could you tell me more about them?
Yes, just a few years ago we were excavating, if you can see where the gap with the small markers is between the stones, we were excavating in that area, and the reason we'd chosen that was because it was an area that Keiller had explored in the 30s and he'd had some really interesting findings. When we were there, what we discovered was that what we appear to have there is an occupation site. A place where people were coming hundreds of years before these stones were put up, but probably at the same time when a much smaller monument is being erected on the footprint of the large henge bank. So sitting on the footprint that's there today, but much smaller in scale. So we're talking about the Middle Neolithic, so several hundred years after the first farmers arrived here. And we found a thing or two while we were there.
What's in your pocket?
Well, this rather wonderful thing is part of a ceremonial mace head. I say part because it's been deliberately broken in 2. So what we can see here is incredibly smooth on the outside, but on the inside we can see the remains where it would have been hafted. So you would have had, if you imagine my finger is a wooden shaft going through the middle, and you can see it's highly polished, and that's because of the way it was made with abrasives to make the hole, to put the shaft in. And these things we know from other contexts are often deliberately broken in mortuary contexts. So in other words, maybe to mark the death of an important individual or part of a ceremony. And it may be that when people are coming here during the Middle Neolithic, either somebody important has died here, or maybe they've brought the ashes of someone with them to be scattered in the wider landscape.
So what would it mean to find something like this on a site like that down there?
Well, finding something like this is an amazing experience, you know, whether it's this or an arrowhead, you know, or a simple piece of stoneworking waste from flint workers, because these things scattered beneath the turf here, they lie beneath people's feet for century upon century and millennia upon millennia, and nobody knows they're there. But To me, what they are the kind of last vestiges of the lives of those people. They're what tell their story. They can't speak, they haven't left any books behind them. So in many ways, it's up to us to uncover those stories and to be able to share them with everybody.
It's just beautiful, and I like to think that the way that we touch this and kind of revere this, the smooth side, the person who made this would have been proud that they'd made such a beautiful and tactile object. So we can really connect to the past, can't we, by walking along these landscapes and thinking what lies beneath our feet and who has lived here.
Absolutely. I think there's a very direct connection in the World Heritage Site with the archaeology, the stuff, if you like, both material objects like this beautiful mace head and arrow heads, and actually literally the turf beneath our feet, the landscape where these people have trodden before us.
Alexander Keiller's influence on Avebury Henge is undeniable. And I want to find out what drove this so-called amateur archaeologist. So I'm catching up with Dr. Ros Cleary, curator for the Alexander Keiller Museum at the National Trust. We are at the Alexander Keiller Museum. Who was he and how did he contribute to our understanding of archaeology on this site?
He was a Scotsman, was born in Dundee, and he came from the Keillers of Dundee Marmalade family. We don't really know why he got into archaeology, but it was an absolute passion. And in those days, there weren't really professional archaeologists. And so, although you can call him an amateur, really he did it in a professional way. And he came to Avebury in the mid-1920s to work at a site called Windmill Hill. And then he moved down into the village and he started work on the stone circle. And he essentially spent several years excavating within Avebury on what we know as the West Kennet Avenue and the Avebury Henge. When he first came to Avebury, there were only 15 standing stones in the henge itself. And there are now 42. So he found most of those. A couple were fallen, but mostly he found them buried and he put them up. So actually the way Avebury looks today, although he didn't make Avebury up, he did restore it in a way.
Gosh, so because a lot of the stuff we know about the site is from his diaries, the way he recorded things. Do we get a sense of what he was like as a person? Like, was this an obsession for him?
Yeah. Oh, yes, I think so. Reading his letters and his notebooks, he's very funny actually at times, but yes, very obsessive. And he didn't do anything in a casual, fun sort of way. When it came to archaeology, he was meticulous.
So you mentioned that he actually erected some of the, or returned some of the stones to their former position. How did he know where to put them?
Well, he absolutely agonised over it. It's really interesting when you see his thinking, and he sort of writes it down. In fact, we know that he dictated. He had a dictating machine, and we have a tiny scrap of his voice. And so he dictated, and we have long, detailed sort of agonisings over, there's this tiny bit of a stone hole left, but it's not complete, and which direction it is, and which way round was the stone. He's thinking it through, in the way that we would do nowadays if we were ever to do what he did, which is unlikely. But he was really thoughtful about it, and I think he probably did his best.
Can you talk me through this beautiful vessel that we've got? I'm just dying to hear more about this.
This is one of my favourite objects. It's a beaker pot. People may have heard of the beaker people, and they can be traced across Europe, and they come to this country from about 4,400 years ago. Now, this doesn't have a radiocarbon date, so we don't know exactly how old this one is. It's certainly over 4,000 years old. And it was disturbed during agriculture, so they were ploughing. So they came across a great sarsen stone, and under it was a grave with about a 5-year-old child in. Wow. And this was the main thing that the child had. There were some flint tools, but this was the main thing. And not everybody was buried with a beaker pot at all. And children are not that common with beakers. So obviously the child had some sort of status, was well thought of, was loved maybe, I'm sure they were. Did they believe that they would need that in the afterlife? It seems to suggest they did believe in an afterlife, doesn't it? I mean, it's sort of, we can't know that, but they're giving people things to take with them.
Wow, and all these little marks, these patterns on there, do we know how they were made?
Mm-hmm. They're mostly made with a little notched tool, a sort of comb, and they press it into the clay when it's quite wet, that sort of pattern, that sort of shape. It's not particularly common to this part of the country. It's possible they came from somewhere else. I mean, we do have pots that have come from elsewhere. So, but it's just beautiful.
It's beautiful. And the story behind it, whoever gave them that pot, they've got the loss of that child and the loss of this important vessel in their culture as well. Yes. So it's now the 35th year of the World Heritage Site. What does that significance mean for you?
I think it's wonderful that we've had 35 years of being recognised, as such an important site. Most people know Stonehenge. Avebury is much less well known. So I think to be included in the World Heritage Site in 1986 was a fantastic thing to have happened. And I think people are more aware of Avebury now. The complexity of the Neolithic, I think, is very well illustrated at Avebury. We don't have the central monument that is unique like Stonehenge is, but we have some pretty astounding monuments. And also there's been such a lot of research, and I think that's been fostered by being part of that World Heritage Site. So we were one of the first in the world to have a research agenda in 2001. And there's hardly been a year now and there hasn't been important research happening in the Avebury area. There are still projects being written up now. And I'm not sure that would have happened without it being a World Heritage Site.
People have been coming to this ancient landscape for millennia, and we still revere this site even today. More recent discoveries at sites like Larkhill and Bulford have helped shed new light on the people and communities who helped shape this amazing ceremonial landscape. But it's also down to the people now in the present, people like the archaeologists, the rangers, the custodians, stewards, and even visitors of the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site that will help us protect it for another 6,000 years.